The fluorescent lights of Grand Central Terminal buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the late commuters rushing to catch their trains home. Maya Chen sat cross-legged on the cold marble floor, her guitar case open before her like a prayer bowl, collecting the occasional coin from passing strangers who barely glanced her way. Her voice, clear and haunting, cut through the cacophony of footsteps and announcements, weaving a melody that seemed to slow time itself. She had chosen this spot carefully, close enough to the main concourse to catch the attention of the evening rush, but tucked into an alcove where the transit police were less likely to move her along. The song she sang was one she had written herself, about dreams that refuse to die even when everything else has crumbled to dust. Her fingers moved across the guitar strings with practiced ease, despite the calluses that had formed from months of playing on unforgiving surfaces. David Harrison's Italian leather shoes clicked against the terminal floor in a rhythm that matched his perpetual state of urgency. The 9:47 to Scarsdale was his lifeline, the last train that would get him home at a reasonable hour, allowing him to collapse into his empty house and lose himself in another glass of scotch. But today, a client call had run long, and now he was sprinting through the terminal like a man possessed, his briefcase bouncing against his hip. He reached the platform, just as the train doors sealed shut with a hydraulic hiss. Through the windows, he could see commuters settling into their seats, phones already out, ready to decompress from another day in the corporate machine. David stood there, chest heaving, watching his routine slip away into the tunnel's darkness. The next train wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. The platform emptied quickly, leaving him alone with his frustration and the echoing announcement of departure times. He turned back toward the main terminal, already calculating the cost of a taxi home versus waiting for the next train, when he heard it, a voice that seemed to reach directly into his chest and squeeze. Maya's song had shifted to something softer, more intimate. The lyrics spoke of finding light in the deepest darkness, of holding on to hope when the world turns its back. But it wasn't just the words that stopped David in his tracks, it was the melody. His breath caught as recognition washed over him like ice water. It was Sarah's favorite song, the one she used to hum while making breakfast on Sunday mornings, the one that had played at their wedding during the first dance. He followed the sound like a man in a trance, his feet carrying him back through the terminal until he found the source. The young woman sitting on the floor looked nothing like his late wife, but her voice. Her voice carried the same ethereal quality that had first drawn him to Sarah 20 years ago. Maya's eyes were closed as she sang, lost in the music, unaware of the small crowd that had gathered to listen. David stood at the edge of the circle, studying her face. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her early 20s, with long black hair that fell like a curtain around her shoulders. Her clothes were clean but worn, layered in a way that suggested she was prepared for cold nights. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances, that commanded respect. The song ended, and Maya opened her eyes, meeting David's gaze across the small space. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was something in her dark eyes, a depth of experience that seemed too old for her face, but also a flicker of wariness that came from months of reading people's intentions in split seconds. "That was beautiful," David said, his voice rougher than he intended. A few people dropped coins into her guitar case and moved on, but he remained standing there, anchored by something he couldn't name. Maya's fingers automatically began picking out another melody, softer this time. "Thank you," she said, her speaking voice carrying the same musical quality as her singing. "I don't think I've seen you here before." "I missed my train," David replied, as if that explained everything. He reached into his wallet, intending to drop a few dollars into her case, but paused. Instead, he pulled out a $20 bill, more than he had ever given to any street performer, but somehow it felt insufficient. As he placed the bill in her case, their fingers brushed briefly. Maya looked up at him with surprise, not at the amount, but at the gentleness of the gesture. Most people dropped their donations from a distance, as if proximity might somehow contaminate them with her circumstances. "The song you were singing earlier," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you learn it?" Maya's hand stilled on the guitar strings. I wrote it a long time ago." She studied his face, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond her. "Did it mean something to you?" David opened his mouth to answer, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain that her melody had somehow captured the essence of a song that existed only in his memory, that she had given voice to something he thought he had lost forever? Instead, he just nodded, his businessman's composure cracking slightly. The terminal continued its evening rhythm around them, but in that small alcove, time seemed suspended. Maya continued to play, softer now, as if she understood that this stranger needed something more than entertainment. And David listened, feeling something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and isolation that had taken up residence there 3 years ago. When Maya finished the song, David was still standing there, his expensive suit looking oddly out of place in the fluorescent terminal lighting. "I should go," he said finally, but he didn't move. "The next train to Scarsdale isn't for another hour and 47 minutes, Maya said quietly. "If you're not in a hurry." David's eyes widened slightly. How had she known his destination? Maya smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "You're not the first commuter to miss the 9:47. I've learned to read the signs." And so, David Harrison, who hadn't sat still for more than 5 minutes outside of sleep in 3 years, found himself sinking down onto the bench nearby, his briefcase forgotten at his feet, listening to a homeless girl with a guitar transform the harsh echo of Grand Central into something resembling home. The melody haunted David for 3 days. It wove itself through his morning meetings, hummed beneath his conference calls, and echoed in the silence of his Scarsdale home each night. He found himself taking the later train intentionally, hoping to catch another glimpse of the girl with the guitar. But the alcove remained empty. The absence felt more profound than her presence had. Maya had learned to read the rhythms of the city like sheet music. She knew which corners yielded the most generous donors, which subway cars offered the safest places to sleep, and which security guards would look the other way. But the businessman in the expensive suit had disrupted her carefully orchestrated survival symphony. His $20 had bought her 2 hot meals and a night in a hostel, but it was the way he had listened, really listened, that lingered in her thoughts. She hadn't always lived this way. Just 10 months ago, she had been Maya Chen, junior at Juilliard, daughter of 2 professors who had sacrificed everything to give her the best musical education money could buy. Her childhood had been filled with piano lessons, voice coaching, and the constant pressure to excel. Her parents, both immigrants who had built their American dream through education, saw her talent as their legacy. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. A truck driver, exhausted from a double shift, had run a red light. In an instant, Maya's world had collapsed like a house of cards. Her parents' life insurance barely covered the funeral costs, and their medical bills had consumed what little savings remained. The small apartment in Queens, which had always felt cramped but cozy, suddenly became unaffordable. Maya had tried to stay in school, working multiple jobs while maintaining her course load, but grief is a relentless companion. Her grades slipped, her scholarship disappeared, and the administrators who had once praised her potential now spoke in the cold language of deadlines and financial obligations. The girl, who had once dreamed of Carnegie Hall, found herself with nothing but a guitar and the clothes on her back. The streets had been her conservatory for the past 8 months. She had learned the harsh acoustics of subway tunnels, the way sound bounced off concrete and tile. She had discovered that people were more generous when they were heading home than when they were rushing to work, that certain songs could make a stranger pause while others made them walk faster. But she had also learned darker lessons. She had learned to sleep with one eye open, to trust no one completely, to recognize the difference between genuine kindness and predatory interest. The businessman's gentle gesture had confused her precisely because it fell into neither category she had come to understand. David sat in his corner office 50 floors above the city, staring out at the urban landscape that sparkled like a circuit board in the afternoon sun. The quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk might as well have been written in Sanskrit for all the attention he was paying them. Instead, he found himself thinking about Sarah, something he had trained himself to avoid during daylight hours. Sarah had been a music teacher before they met, working with underprivileged kids in the Bronx. She had seen potential where others saw problems, had believed in the transformative power of melody and rhythm. After they married, she had given up teaching to support his career, but she never stopped humming, never stopped finding music in the mundane moments of their life together. The song the girl had been singing wasn't Sarah's favorite. He had been wrong about that. But the melody, the way she had shaped the notes, had somehow captured the essence of what he had lost. It was as if she had reached into his memory and given voice to something he couldn't articulate. His assistant knocked on the door, interrupting his reverie. "Mr. Harrison, your wife's sister is on line 2. David's stomach tightened. He had been avoiding Rebecca's calls for weeks, knowing she wanted to discuss the upcoming 3rd anniversary of Sarah's death. "Tell her I'm in a meeting," he said, then immediately felt the familiar wash of guilt. Rebecca meant well, but her attempts to draw him back into the world of the living felt like betrayal. That evening, David found himself taking the subway instead of his usual car service. He told himself it was more efficient, but his feet carried him directly to Grand Central, to the alcove where he had first heard Maya sing. She wasn't there, but he waited anyway, feeling foolish but unable to leave. Maya was 3 blocks away, huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore, her guitar case clutched protectively to her chest. The October wind cut through her layers like a blade, and she pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders. She had tried to sing in Washington Square Park earlier, but the police had moved her along twice. Her usual spot at Grand Central was occupied by another performer, an older man with a saxophone who had claimed territorial rights. She closed her eyes and let herself remember the warmth of her childhood home, the way her mother's voice had carried through the house when she cooked dinner, the sound of her father's laughter echoing from his study. These memories were dangerous luxuries. They made the present unbearable, but sometimes she couldn't help herself. The businessman's face appeared in her mind's eye, the way his expression had shifted when she sang, as if she had accidentally unlocked something inside him. She had seen that look before, in the faces of people who had lost something precious. It was the look of someone trying to hold on to an echo. Maya made a decision. She packed up her guitar and walked the 3 blocks to Grand Central, her feet moving with purpose despite the cold. She had no idea if he would be there, but something told her he might be. Some melodies once heard demanded to be completed. David was still waiting when she arrived, sitting on the bench where he had listened to her sing 3 nights ago. He looked older somehow, his shoulders carrying an invisible weight. When he saw her approaching, relief flooded his features. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that his boardroom persona would never have allowed. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," Maya replied, settling into her usual spot on the floor. She opened her guitar case and began tuning the strings, her fingers working automatically while her mind processed this unexpected reunion. "I've been thinking about your song," David said, "the one about finding light in darkness." Maya's hands stilled on the guitar neck. "What about it?" "I think I needed to hear it," David said simply. "I think I've been living in darkness for a long time." Maya studied his face. noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and accumulated sorrow. "We all have our shadows," she said quietly. "The trick is learning to sing through them." She began to play, not the song from 3 nights ago, but something new, something that seemed to build itself note by note in the space between them. David listened, feeling something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight grip he had maintained on his grief. As Maya's voice filled the alcove, other commuters began to stop and listen. But this time, David didn't feel like part of the audience. He felt like a participant in something larger, something that transcended the boundaries between performer and listener, between the housed and the homeless, between the living and the merely surviving. When the song ended, David reached into his wallet again, but Maya held up a hand. "Keep your money," she said. "Sometimes the most valuable transactions don't involve currency." David's eyes widened. "Then what do you want?" Maya smiled, and for a moment the years of hardship seemed to fall away from her face. "I want you to tell me about the song that made you stop walking that first night, the one that meant something to you." And so David Harrison, who hadn't spoken his late wife's name aloud in over a year, found himself telling a stranger about Sarah's morning humming, about the way she had found music in grocery lists and traffic jams, about the silence that had followed her death like a suffocating blanket. Maya listened, her guitar forgotten in her lap, understanding that sometimes the most powerful songs are the ones that exist only in memory, waiting for someone brave enough to give them voice again. The following week brought an early November chill that seemed to seep into Maya's bones and settle there like a persistent ache. She had been returning to Grand Central each evening, not necessarily expecting to see David, but finding comfort in the routine they had inadvertently created. He had appeared 3 times, always catching the later train, always listening with that same intense focus that made her feel like her music mattered. Tonight was different. When David approached her usual spot, he carried 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries. Maya's stomach betrayed her with a soft growl, reminding her that she had eaten only a stale bagel that morning. "I thought you might be cold," David said, offering her one of the cups. His corporate armor seemed less polished tonight, his tie loosened and his expensive coat unbuttoned. Maya accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. "Thank you," she said, inhaling the rich aroma. "You don't have to keep doing this." "I know," David replied, settling onto the bench, "but I want to." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the evening commuters rushing past them like water around stones. Maya sipped her coffee and studied David's profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking. "The song you wanted to hear," Maya said suddenly. "Your wife's favorite. What was it about?" David's hands stilled around his coffee cup. "It was called Coming Home. She used to say it reminded her that home wasn't a place, but a feeling, a sense of belonging somewhere, with someone." Maya nodded slowly. "I think I understand." She set down her coffee and picked up her guitar, her fingers finding the strings with practiced ease. "What if I told you that I could play it? The song she loved? But you said you wrote your own songs." "I did, but I also know hundreds of others. It's part of surviving out here, reading what people need to hear." Maya's voice grew softer. What did her voice sound like when she sang it? David closed his eyes, the memory washing over him, like honey and rain, warm but cleansing. Maya began to play, her voice taking on a different quality, softer and more ethereal. The melody that emerged wasn't the song from that first night, but something David recognized with a jolt of recognition. It was Coming Home, not exactly as Sarah had sung it, but close enough to make his breath catch. When she finished, David was silent for a long moment. "How did you—" "Music has its own language," Maya said gently. "Sometimes we recognize melodies we've never heard before because they speak to something universal." David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Maya, I want to help you, really help you." Maya's posture shifted, her defenses rising. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," David said quickly. "It's I don't know what it is, but you've given me something I didn't even know I'd lost. Let me return the favor. What are you suggesting? David took a breath, the words feeling strange in his mouth. I have a guest house. It's been empty for 2 years. You could stay there. Get back on your feet. No strings attached. Maya's eyes widened. You don't even know me. I know your music. I know your heart. Sometimes that's enough. Maya stood abruptly, her guitar in her hands. People don't just give away homes to strangers. They don't usually sit on subway benches listening to homeless girls sing either, David replied. But here we are. Maya paced the small space, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed danger, but something in David's eyes spoke of genuine intent. Why? She asked finally. David met her gaze steadily. Because 3 years ago, I lost my home too. Not the house, the feeling. And for the first time since then, when I listened to you sing, I remember what it felt like to be somewhere I belonged. Maya stared at him, her heart pounding. This is insane. Probably, David agreed, but so is living on the streets when you have a gift like yours. Maya sank back down, her guitar cradled in her lap. If I said yes, and I'm not saying I am, what would you want in return? Nothing, David said. Just keep singing. Keep reminding me that music still exists in the world. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Maya looked at this stranger who had somehow become familiar. This man who claimed to want nothing but was offering everything. Let me think about it, she said finally. David nodded, understanding that some decisions couldn't be rushed. Take all the time you need. Maya spent 2 sleepless nights weighing David's offer, her mind cycling between hope and suspicion. On the 3rd evening, she found him waiting in their usual spot, patient as always, with no pressure in his eyes, only quiet understanding. When she whispered yes, he simply nodded and handed her a business card with an address written on the back. The guest house sat behind David's main residence like a secret, connected by a stone pathway lined with dormant rose bushes. It was small but complete. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living area with windows that overlooked a garden Maya could imagine blooming in spring. David showed her the basics, how the heating worked, where the towels were kept, the spare key hidden under a ceramic turtle by the door. I'll be traveling for work the next few days, he said, maintaining a careful distance that respected her need for space. Make yourself at home. Home. The word felt foreign on her tongue after months of temporary shelters and doorway alcoves. Maya stood in the doorway after David left, afraid to cross the threshold, as if entering might somehow make this fragile gift disappear. The first shower she took lasted 30 minutes. Hot water had become a luxury she'd forgotten to appreciate, and she stood under the spray until her skin turned pink and the bathroom filled with steam. She found clothes in her size waiting on the bed, simple things, jeans and sweaters that still had tags attached. David had somehow managed this kindness without making her feel like a charity case. That night, Maya lay in a real bed for the first time in 8 months, but sleep eluded her. The silence felt too complete, too safe. She had grown accustomed to the urban symphony of sirens and late-night conversations, the constant vigilance that survival demanded. Peace was more unsettling than chaos. David called from Chicago the next day, his voice careful and professional. How are you settling in? Maya searched for words. I keep expecting someone to tell me I don't belong here. You do belong there, David said quietly, for as long as you want to stay. The conversation revealed small details about their lives. David learned that Maya had once played Carnegie Hall as a student, that she wrote songs on napkins when inspiration struck, that she missed her mother's Korean cooking more than anything. Maya discovered that David had built his company from nothing, that he still set 2 places at his breakfast table out of habit, that he hadn't touched the piano in his living room since Sarah died. She played, Maya asked. Beautifully, better than she knew. David's voice carried a smile. She would have loved your music. When David returned from his trip, he found Maya in the garden, sitting cross-legged with her guitar, working through a new composition. The melody drifted through his kitchen window as he made dinner, filling the empty spaces of his house with something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. They began sharing evening meals, tentative at first, then with growing ease. David cooked with the precision of someone who had learned out of necessity, while Maya contributed stories that made him laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. She told him about the businessman who had tried to tip her with a business card for a legitimate job, about the grandmother who had shared her sandwich every Tuesday for a month, about the couple who had gotten engaged to one of her songs. "People think the streets are empty of kindness," Maya said one evening, helping David clear the dishes. "But I found more genuine humanity there than I ever did in concert halls." David paused in his washing. "Is that why you're afraid to trust this?" Maya's hand stilled on the dish towel. "Partly, but also because I'm afraid of forgetting who I was before. The girl who survived 8 months on nothing but music and stubbornness. She's stronger than the one who lived in comfort." "Maybe you don't have to choose," David said. "Maybe you can be both." That night, David sat at his piano for the first time in 3 years, his fingers finding the keys of Coming Home, while Maya's guitar harmonized from the guest house, their music weaving together across the garden like a conversation neither had known they needed to have. 3 weeks into her new life, Maya found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. David had mentioned almost casually over breakfast that his company was looking for someone to help with a community outreach program, teaching music to underprivileged kids. The position came with a salary, benefits, and the chance to rebuild the career she had lost. "You don't have to decide now," David said, noting her silence. "Just think about it." But Maya couldn't stop thinking about it. The offer represented everything she had dreamed of before her world collapsed, yet something held her back. She spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhood, her guitar slung across her back, trying to understand her own resistance. The answer came when she passed a subway entrance and heard the faint sound of someone singing below. Without thinking, she descended the stairs and found a young man about her age, his voice raw with hunger and desperation. His guitar case held only a few coins, and his clothes bore the telltale signs of someone new to the streets. Maya approached slowly, recognizing the careful wariness in his eyes. "Mind if I listen?" He nodded, continuing his song with slightly more confidence. When he finished, Maya sat beside him on the platform bench. "How long have you been out here?" 2 weeks, he said, his voice barely audible above the rumble of an approaching train. "Lost my job, couldn't make rent. You know how it goes." Maya did know. She opened her guitar case and began to play, her voice joining his in an impromptu duet that drew curious stares from passing commuters. For the first time in weeks, she felt the familiar electricity of connection through music, the raw honesty that only existed when survival depended on the power of your voice. That evening, David found her sitting in the garden, staring at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. "You're having second thoughts," he said, settling beside her on the bench he had installed the week before. "Not about staying here," Maya said quickly. "About the job, about moving forward." "Because?" Maya struggled to articulate the conflict raging inside her. "When I was on the streets, I knew who I was. I was the girl who refused to give up, who found music in the darkest places. Now I have comfort, security, opportunity. But what if accepting all of this makes me forget the people I'm leaving behind?" David was quiet for a long moment. "What if it gives you the power to help them instead?" "That's what I keep telling myself. But there's this voice in my head that says I don't deserve this, that I'm betraying everyone who's still out there singing for coins." "Maya," David said gently, "survivor's guilt is real. I know because I've lived with it for 3 years. Why did I survive the crash that killed Sarah? Why do I get to continue living when she doesn't?" Maya turned to look at him, seeing vulnerability in his expression she hadn't noticed before. "The answer I've learned," David continued, "is that survival isn't a betrayal of those we've lost or left behind. It's a responsibility. You survived 8 months on the streets, not so you could feel guilty about escaping them, but so you could use that experience to make a difference. Before Maya could respond, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's my office. I need to take this." Maya watched him walk toward the house, his voice already shifting into business mode. But as he spoke, she heard fragments that made her stomach tighten. "What do you mean she's living there?" And, "I don't care about optics, Rebecca, but..." And finally, "We'll discuss this when I get back to the office tomorrow." When David returned, his face was carefully neutral, but Maya had learned to read the tension in his shoulders. "Everything okay?" "Just work stuff," he said, but Maya noticed he wouldn't meet her eyes. That night, Maya lay awake, knowing that their fragile sanctuary was about to be tested. She had heard enough to understand that someone, probably someone important, had discovered David's arrangement and wasn't pleased about it. The question was whether David would stand by his offer when the pressure mounted, or whether this beautiful interlude was about to end. In the main house, David sat at his kitchen table with a glass of scotch, staring at his phone. Rebecca's message was clear. The board had concerns about his judgment, clients were asking questions, and his reputation was at stake. He had until tomorrow's meeting to decide what mattered more, his career or the girl who had reminded him how to feel human again. The choice, he realized, would define not just Maya's future, but his own. David left for his meeting the next morning without his usual goodbye, his face drawn with the weight of decisions that would reshape both their lives. Maya watched from the guest house window as his car disappeared down the street, carrying with it the fragile piece they had built together. She spent the morning packing her few belongings, preparing for the inevitable. When you've lived with uncertainty for months, you learn to recognize when sanctuary is about to end. The guitar case that had once held her entire world seemed absurdly small now, but it would have to be enough again. David sat in the gleaming conference room, surrounded by suits and spreadsheets, listening to Rebecca outline the board's concerns. His personal situation was affecting company perception. Clients were questioning his judgment. Stockholders were nervous about leadership stability. The solution was simple: distance himself from the situation and focus on rebuilding his professional reputation. "She's not a situation," David said quietly, interrupting Rebecca mid-sentence. "Her name is Maya, and she's more talented than anyone in this room." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "David, I understand you're still grieving Sarah, but this isn't the way to heal. You're projecting..." "Don't!" David's voice carried a steel that made the room fall silent. "Don't analyze my grief or my motivations. For 3 years I've been sleepwalking through life, going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. Maya didn't just remind me what music sounds like, she reminded me what it feels like to care about something beyond profit margins and quarterly reports." He stood, his hands flat on the polished table. "You want to know what's affecting my judgment? It's sitting in rooms like this, pretending that success means forgetting how to be human." When David returned home that afternoon, he found Maya's note on the kitchen table. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. I won't let your generosity become a burden. The job offer was beautiful, but I need to find my own way back to music. You gave me more than shelter. You gave me back my voice." David rushed to the guest house, finding it empty except for the spare key sitting on the small dining table. But as he stood in the doorway, he heard it. Guitar music floating from the garden. Maya sat beneath the oak tree, her back against its trunk, playing a new song that seemed to capture both gratitude and goodbye. "I thought you'd left," David said, approaching slowly. "I tried," Maya admitted, not stopping her gentle strumming. "I made it 3 blocks before I realized I was running from the wrong thing." "What do you mean?" Maya set down her guitar and looked at him directly. "I've been afraid of accepting help because I thought it made me weak. But walking away from someone who genuinely cares about my well-being, that's the real weakness." David sat beside her on the grass, his expensive suit forgotten. "I told the board where they could put their concerns." Maya's eyes widened. "David, you didn't have to..." "Yes, I did. Because home isn't a place you find, it's a place you choose to build. And I choose to build it with someone who understands that music matters more than money. 6 months later, Maya stood on a small stage in a community center in the Bronx, teaching guitar to a group of teenagers who reminded her of herself at that age, hungry for something beautiful in a world that often forgot to provide it. David sat in the back row, no longer the isolated businessman who had missed his train that night, but someone who had learned that the most successful life is one filled with the music of genuine connection. The program Maya developed became a model for other cities, proof that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a simple choice to stop walking past someone who needs to be heard. And every evening, when Maya returned to the guest house that had become simply home, she and David would sit in the garden and play together, their melodies weaving through the rose bushes that had bloomed again with the spring. Maya had learned that accepting help wasn't betraying her strength, it was multiplying it. And David had discovered that the emptiness left by loss could be filled not by forgetting, but by choosing to love differently, more openly, with the wisdom that comes from understanding how precious and fragile connection truly is. Their music still echoed through Grand Central some nights, but now it carried a different message, that home is found not in the perfection of circumstance, but in the courage to let someone else's song harmonize with your own.